Don't know if spring weather has hit your part of the country yet, but it officially starts based on the calendar on March 21st. But if you're an Oklahoma fan, it's more important that it actually starts on March 22nd. That's when spring practice opens. We got Jason Ray on the line from Last Word on College Football to break down the Sooners. Jason, how you doing today?
Good, Mark. Thanks for having me on. How are you?
Absolutely, doing well. Lincoln Riley held his news conference, pre-spring news conference. Your initial thoughts about what he had to say?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more excitement maybe than you've seen in the past out of Lincoln Riley. Certainly, he's a very positive coach in terms of being more kind of a rah-rah guy, but you could see a little bit of a glimmer in his eye and excitement in his voice as he's talking about this season. Maybe it's a little bit just in terms of he's got the worst part of probably the COVID protocols behind him in terms of kind of looking forward into a 2021 season. But I think just in terms of knowing how good of a team that he feels that he has coming into the 2021 season, he was really quoted as saying the team has done very, very well during this initial offseason period. So, to say those words and talk about how experienced of a team that he has, and, there's leaders already kind of coming to the forefront on both sides of the ball early on before even spring balls even started. I think it kind of tells a story in terms of where Oklahoma can be from 2020 to 2021. One of the things early on in 2020 that you could see in the season is Oklahoma didn't have a whole lot of leadership on both sides of the ball. Jalen Hurts leaving that past year was the unquestioned leader of the offensive team and overall on the team over in general. But then you look at 2020 and there wasn't a whole lot of leaders, but now you're seeing a few leaders on both sides of the ball be a little bit more vocal. So I think that's exciting for this Oklahoma team that's going into this 2021 season with a lot of expectations. Really kind of sounded like a title or bust type of mentality that they have going forward, and that's exactly what you would look for in a team that's probably going to be in the top 3 or 4 in the country coming into 2021.
And that's one of the intangibles that coaches like to talk about in regards to each individual team. Each year is a different team. We like to look at the personnel and say, well, they got 80% back from their offensive production from last year. They should be good to go. But 1 or 2 new starters along the offensive front, maybe playing out of position, could certainly affect a team. There's all sorts of intangibles involved, both from the player chemistry on the field and then in the locker room that really you can't put a finger on. You just have to know as an expert of that locker room and the relationships that you have and in how to lead young men, of what kind of pulse you have on that team and how to direct them, whether that's a pat on the back or a kick in the rear kind of mentality. And Lincoln Riley certainly has shown that he knows his team. Patrick Fields is certainly a contributor to that 2020 success, 44 tackles, plus a tackle for loss and a pick, but he's going to miss spring practice. Do we know any other players that could be absent or compromised for the spring?
No, Mark, I think that's the only major contributor that you would expect to come out. Early on in these press conferences, one of the biggest questions, especially right now with COVID, is just really who's going to be available and who's not. So from an injury perspective, he said that Pat Fields was really the only one that was going to miss any significant amount of time. He had a small procedure done early on just to clean something up. He didn't really go into detail into where exactly or what exactly that injury was, but just some small cleanup that he said he would probably miss a majority of spring, if not all. There's some thoughts that he could get back towards the end of spring. But I think, Mark, to your point about Pat Fields and just his journey with Oklahoma, he was a team captain last year. He's a 2-year starter, so he's probably a guy, especially in that crowded secondary, that may not necessarily need to get the full extent of spring ball. Certainly missing last year is an impact, but I think of all the guys in the back end of the secondary, he's one of those guys that probably doesn't necessarily need to have that spring ball on one side. On the other side, you've got a lot of new kids that are vying for positions. You got Key Lawrence, who's the transfer from Tennessee, who's going to be battling in the safety position. You got Justin Harrington, who's probably maybe a nickel back or a free safety or strong safety. Kind of depends on what that looks like for the Sooners. But so I think when you look at that, there's a lot of competition. That's something that Lincoln Riley alluded to, just in terms of the competition at the secondary. He kind of talked about those guys look a little different than what they've had in the past, just from an athletic perspective. That we talked about how Grinch likes to have taller kids in there, and one of the things that you could see, and Riley talked a little bit about, is the athleticism is a little bit different, but in the same token, he was really excited to kind of see what that battle looks like with some of those new kids. And they don't lose a whole lot. Brendan Radley-Hiles has moved on to Washington, so he'll no longer be there. But essentially, they have a lot of competition with some of the newer kids and some of the kids that will be stepping up. And specifically, Jeremiah Cradell, who is a safety, really a ballyhooed recruit from Oklahoma. He's going to be a redshirt sophomore this year. Redshirt his first year, was a redshirt freshman last year. Hasn't played a lot. He's going to be a guy that's going to be counted on to at least compete for one of those starting spots. So there's about 4 or 5 kids that have a chance, with Pat Fields being out, to put themselves in a better position as they exit spring ball this year.
Jason, Ray and myself have broken down the Oklahoma team position by position. I put myself on that headline, but it's basically Jason has broken down the Oklahoma team position by position, and he just ran down what Lincoln Riley had to say in his introductory spring news conference concerning the secondary. So you can check out his breakdown of the secondary. Trey Norwood and Trey Brown, of course, come to mind. 8 interceptions lost from that 2020 team. Please like the video, share them out on social media, and subscribe right here at the Voice of College Football. All right, on the flip side of the defensive backs, of course, the wide receivers, Charleston Rambo, the one missing component from last season with 25 catches last year, 43 the year before. And Lincoln Riley also talked about getting that explosiveness back in the passing game.
Yeah, I think honestly, Mark, reading between the lines, that was the area, and not particularly a big surprise, but that was the area where Riley, he kind of sent a message. It sounded like, to his wide receivers. He talked a little bit about how maybe that group wasn't as good as it's been in the past from a productivity perspective. Really talked about some of the most interesting battles that he feels that they'll see through spring ball could be in the wide receiver room. So that was interesting to see. And we talked a little bit about this, that certainly Rambo moving on to Miami is a blow. He didn't have an incredibly great season. Marvin Mims came out, was the clear playmaker, but they had a lot of moving parts in terms of, Trajan Bridges was out for a majority of the year. Jaden Hazelwood missed a majority of the year with an ACL injury. So having some of those guys healthy and back will be interesting, in terms of what he talked a little bit about. We may shuffle some positions around to get those best guys on the field. Got a couple of freshmen coming in that are going to, in the spring, that are going to, start with some, to try to get in there from a playing time perspective. Mario Williams is a guy who's a true freshman, came in, who's turned some heads a little bit early on. And I think one player that's really interesting that we talked a little bit about through some of our positions is Billy Bowman. So I think, there was some thought early on in the year through the recruiting process that Riley and had talked about. We don't really know where he's going to play. He could play wide receiver, could play defensive back, could be a specialist here and there. So, but it looks like when Oklahoma released the roster for the spring, that Alex Grinch may have won the first battle, in spring camp, where he's listed as a defensive back. So I think they'll probably move him a little bit around, but at this point they have him listed at defensive back. I don't know, just in terms of reading into that, maybe I think the wide receiver room may be a little bit more crowded than the defensive back room right now, just in terms of players that they have in for the spring. So that might be one of the reasons why he's at defensive back. So I don't know if that means they're going to give him the first look at defensive back and then, maybe move him back to wide receiver, or see how that works out. But interesting that his first position description was at defensive back.
Got Jason Ray on the line from Last Word on College Football to break down the Sooners following Lincoln Riley's introductory news conference for the spring practice that starts on March 22nd. Look at the banner below. You can register at thevoiceofcollegefootball.com for free. right at the top of the web page. It says register for free. Just click on that. You get a free mask. So Oklahoma fans, we've got that available. We've got about 35 teams available. So get your Oklahoma mask, and you also qualify for a $25 gift card and also 20% off your first purchase. Don't need to purchase anything, but if you so choose, 20% off that first purchase. And again, get your free mask. All right. Jason, you talked intangibles off the top in response to what Lincoln Riley had to say about new team, new year. You never know how the chemistry is going to be, the leadership. The other component that is non-existent from previous years is the addition of another year for pretty much everybody, but is most significant for those seniors or those players who would have lost eligibility, number one. Number two, for those guys that opted out for 2020. And, you know, we can only conjecture, we can only look at the personnel addition going from 2019 now to 2021 for those particular players, but there's got to be some type of, you know, chemistry, just getting them acclimated back into the football operation, number one. But number two, whatever the thoughts and feelings of the players are who participated and played through the season last year in 2020, it really can't be measured, but it's a dynamic that these coaches are going to have to deal with.
No, absolutely, Mark. And in terms of the opt-outs, Oklahoma has two players, specifically one on each side of the ball. Kennedy Brooks, from a running back perspective, who opted out in 2020, and then Jalen Redmond, and also on the defensive side of the ball. Now, look, the coaches, the players, they all said the right things in terms of chemistry on the offseason. Yeah, we fully support their decisions to stay back, to not participate. Every person has that right. Every person has that decision. So we'll see how that goes. I mean, I think one of the good things about both of those players is both of those have played a decent amount of football for Oklahoma. So I think, you know, Kennedy Brooks was a back-to-back 1,000-yard rusher coming into 2020. Jalen Redmond had about 6.5 sacks in the 2019 season. So I think both of those kids have played a decent amount, and I think the team knows that both of those kids will be needed, you know, potentially a starter on both sides of the ball. Kennedy Brooks, you know, I think the big question coming in is, to your point, yes, a cohesiveness, yes, a chemistry issue, but you know, what were they able to do in that full season of not playing football? For some of them, you know, they had no affiliation with the team, no no practice. What were they able to do in terms of, you know, working out to keep fresh, to keep to not be rusty? So you got to think Oklahoma from a running back perspective. You have Kennedy Brooks, certainly. You have Seth McGowan. You have Marcus Major that came in there. So all three of those guys will be competing, of course, with Eric Gray, who is a transfer from a transfer from Tennessee into Oklahoma. So I think that will be interesting to see exactly how quickly Kennedy Brooks gets back up to that 1-2 spot. Is he there? Has he worked, you know, well throughout the offseason? And then Jalen Redmond on the defensive line for Oklahoma. I think he's another guy that's, you know, could be counted on to be a starter among that defensive line. Interesting, the height and the weights came out the other day on the roster. So in his last game in 2019, Jalen Redmond was at 266. Now he's at 284. You know, what does that look like? I think you're going to see him play inside more at the defensive tackle position, and then you'll see Isaiah Thomas kind of slide outside more at the defensive end to take advantage of both of their strong suits. But you know, what kind of shape is he in? Where is he at mentally? He's struggled with blood clots throughout his career, so I think he was probably more accepted. It was really not even a second thought with his medical issues that he's had in the past. So I think having those two kids back in the fold and going through spring ball, having that spring practice this year is going to be, you know, completely invaluable for both of those kids. And you'd mentioned a couple of kids that that have the opportunity to come back as seniors. Caleb Kelly is one who's been with the program quite some time, had two, really catastrophic injuries. Early on, Riley had talked about how much of a leader he is on the defensive side of the ball. He talked about, from a vocal perspective, he was the unquestioned leader of that linebacker room, especially. And then Eric Swinson's another guy among the offensive line that came back for his second senior season. So he'll certainly battle with some of those kids. Anton Harrison at the tackle position, maybe Wanye Morris on the other tackle, depending on how Oklahoma Beanville decides to do that. So 4 kids that are, had the opportunity to come back this year that could be, really a key part of the team in 2021.
So going back to 2019, as Jason mentioned, Kennedy Brooks with his second of 2,000-yard seasons, 6.5 yards per carry, 6 touchdowns, and also Redmond, in addition to the 6.5 sacks that Jason mentioned, 11 tackles for loss and 23 tackles, 11 behind the line of scrimmage. And Caleb Kelly's season was cut short, where it was almost non-existent in 2019. Jason Ray discussing Oklahoma football with us following Lincoln Riley's first spring news conference. March 22nd is the date. Mark it in your books. The Sooners hit the field for 15 sessions. Should be a good time, and hopefully we'll get some news out of spring practice to be able to report. In addition to that, Jason, do we know when the spring game is?
Yeah, it's going to be April 24th. They haven't identified a time for the kickoff, but the spring game is going to be on April 24th.
There we go. All right, Jason, appreciate you stopping by as always.
All right, thanks for having me on, Mark.